Hello, I'm Bruce Harders, and this is Voices in the Village. Today we have 93 young Bob Meyer, a captain, a former captain or a current captain in the U.S., was it Army or Air Force?
Air Force.
U.S. Air Force. And not only that, but he piloted something called gliders we're going to talk about. Bob, thanks for coming by and welcome to Voices in the Village.
Nice to be here.
Bob, you have a very interesting background in terms of your family. I would call your family sort of an all-American family. You know what I'm talking about?
Yes. My great-great-grandfather came here from England and settled in Pennsylvania.
What year was that?
Oh, about 1633.
1630, that's like 40-some years before the Declaration of Independence.
That's right. He was a farmer. They have a special term for those people, I don't know. It used to be called, oh, my mind is slipping on me here. When someone is almost like an honorable, but we didn't have that.
Well, he was certainly a gentleman farmer,
yes,
that's
Esquire.
For sure. Esquire.
Esquire.
He had a big spread, right?
Yes, he had a big spread.
And he had a very famous visitor one day. Who was that?
Well, he kept a diary, and I was going through excerpts of his diary some months ago, and I was shocked to find out that he had entertained George Washington and his staff and his home because the farm was not far from Valley Forge.
What a fantastic story. Now, okay, so you had him, and then we go to your grandfather. And what was he about?
Well, my grandfather was a minister, but going on from him, my father was a pilot in the First World War.
So the first military guy in the service
was my father.
Also flying.
Yeah, it was my father.
And what was he flying?
He was flying what they used to call a Jenny.
What did that look like?
Well, that's a baling wire and a motor.
That was really an interesting time for flight, wasn't it?
Yes. It's flying by guess and by gosh.
Yeah. Your father.
My grandfather.
Your grandfather.
Great-grandfather. Right. Came here from Germany on my dad's side.
Uh-huh.
And he arrived here just at the beginning of the war between the states.
So we're looking at
the
the
Civil
War now.
And he applied to the Illinois State Militia, which is an organization I joined in World War II. And my great-grandfather was 6'8" tall. And if you'll think back during the war between the states, the average height of a man was about 5'3". And here's someone 6'8". And the colonel was most disturbed. He said, "We can't get a uniform for him." And the captain said, "That's all right. We just lost our tailor, and we'll set him up on a table and let him sew bullet holes." So that's what he did.
Well, anyway, I think we got it straight now. We've got George Washington visiting one guy, and then we've got the Flying Jenny, and we've got the Civil War, and now getting in the Second World War. There was you and your brother in that, wasn't it?
My brother was about 3 years before me, and he was flying in Africa during the time I was a student.
Now, you started out in high school in ROTC.
Right.
What kind of an experience for a young man at that time was that?
Well, I had been a Boy Scout, and I liked the regime and the regulations and the power flow that goes from that. And so I had a choice for going to athletics or going into the ROTC, Reserve Officers Training, and I took the ROTC.
You know, many years later, when I was in college, a lot of people did exactly the same thing. They didn't want to monkey around with Jim, so they joined the ROTC. Right. Now, you obviously, as you talked to me before, you obviously were a good pilot, not only a glider pilot, but a regular pilot. What skills and what capabilities do you think that allowed you to be a really good pilot?
Well, first off, I had good eyesight. 2015, which is a little better than normal. So I could use those. And because I had become a glider pilot, I learned to recognize a lot of the problems that power pilots didn't recognize. In other words, we flew by the seat of our pants, and therefore we had a feel for the airplane, which was very important. also developed in us the necessity of always looking for a place to land. Because if you lost your toe, you were going down.
Right.
And so whether you walked away from it or not, would depend on your skill of finding an open field and landing without hurting yourself.
Now there was a general by the name of Hap Arnold. They really put together the
He
U.S.
was the head of the Air Force.
He was the guy that put together the glider thing, right?
Right.
And there were a few. Russia and Germany both were into the glider
All the
business. weren't they?
major nations in the world had gliders. Italy had them, China had them, Japan had them. We were latecomers.
Yeah. Now I know you've told stories about how when you could land, sometimes you couldn't see anything. It was totally dark until at the very last minute, et cetera, et cetera. Did that happen quite a bit?
Well, this main time it happened was in Normandy. We took off at 12:30 from England and flew around England over air bases, picking up more gliders, more tow ships. But the trouble was there was a high overcast clouds, and it was so dark I could not see the tow plane.
Now I think we need to talk about the point too that these gliders were towed by a giant airplane,
C-47.
C-47.
The first airliners.
And at some point in time, they had to cut the tow line, let you guys go, and land where you needed to land.
Well, it's a little bit different than that is because they weren't allowed to cut us. And the reason was the tow hitch that connected us to the tow plane weighed about 25 pounds.
Wow.
And you could imagine a 25-pound cannonball coming back in your face. So we did the cutoff. They would signal us with a green light and tell us now's the time, and you'd cut off and do what you had to do. Unfortunately, in Normandy, it was so dark I couldn't see the tow plane. So those 5 hours I spent flying all over England,
Right.
getting a glider train together,
Right.
I couldn't see the plane.
Right.
So I flew by the exhaust,
By the exhaust.
the twin exhaust coming from those airplanes. That's what I flew. And I'm telling you, we went a little bit berserk after a while. In fact, one time I chased the North Star because that's very hard to do.
Yeah. How did it come to be? Obviously, when you went into service, you weren't expecting to fly gliders. You were hoping to fly those
Right.
bigger planes.
That's right.
How in the world did you end up as a glider pilot?
Well, I went through basic training in Kelly Field, which is the academic part, and then I was transferred up to Bowman Field in Bottom, Texas, and there I learned to fly what they call primary. And after that, I graduated and was sent to Texas, to the West Point of the Air, to learn to fly the larger airplane, the BT-13. Unfortunately, I had a bad experience at that time. I went through the training and got through, and I was recovering in my bunk, resting up after all the trials and tribulations. And I had a call from my instructor that said, "We goofed." I said, "How's that, sir?" He said, "We're an hour short." Oh, so, "Sir, I've got a very bad cold, and I don't think I can fly another hour." He said, "Son, you're going to have to." But he said, "I'll do the flying, and you just ride as a passenger, and we'll have some fun." Well, fun to a pilot is when you have a day in Texas, huge cumulus clouds that climb so high. We would pretend we're toboggans, and we'd follow the contour of that plane. And that's a lot of fun. It's like coming down the mountainside. And however, after the second trip down, he said, "Oh my Lord." He said, "I'm supposed to meet my girlfriend." And he peeled off, which means he went like this, and from about 12,000 feet to 1,000 feet, and I died. Well, the change in air pressure is quite substantial, and it blew my eardrums. And I spent 2 weeks in the hospital at Bonham, Texas, overcoming what I thought was a busted eardrum, and found that my class had graduated. I thought I'd just go into the class behind it, and they said, "No, with your ears, we can't use you."
That was a shock.
Well, there's my entire future. I've been working towards this for years. And so when I met the board, which told us what we could do, they said we have several choices. You can be a liaison pilot. You can be a pilot that looks for guns at the front so you can identify where they are. Or, well, we do have a new one. It's called glider pilots. And I said, sir, what is a glider pilot? He said, a glider pilot is an airplane that has no motors. Oh, that's interesting. I said, well, how does it fly? He said, you're towed behind a large transport. And they tow you to the area where you need to go. They signal you, you cut off, and make a dead stick landing, meaning you have no power to help you, behind the enemy lines. And you'll be at least 5 miles behind the enemy line. There may become a time that you'll be 100 miles, which I did in Holland.
Right. So that was, now, if you hadn't become a glider pilot, you had a couple other options.
Yeah, I could become just a passenger flying small planes, carrying messages, or looking for sites for German guns.
Right. Well, now, did your hearing ever come back?
Well, my hearing came back. My ears healed, but the damage was done.
The damage was already done.
Because I was removed from the Air Force,
Right.
Army Air Force at that time, and ended up the best thing I could get was a glider pilot.
Well, Bob, this has really been interesting. You know, World War II, that was a long time of war, and I think we have a lot more to talk to you about. So this is going to be our first part of a two-part series.
Thank you.
So thanks for coming by, Bob. And for you folks out there, this is Bruce Harders with Voices in the Village, and we'll see you with Bob in the near future. Thanks a lot, and goodbye.
Parkinson's disease is a neurological movement disorder affecting an estimated 1 million Americans, including many under age 40. It has no cure. Parkinson's is not limited to how a person moves. It can also cause symptoms like depression, fatigue, and impaired speech. Today, there is a new diagnosis every 9 minutes, though Parkinson's can be present for years before being diagnosed. The American Parkinson Disease Association is the largest grassroots network in the United States, working to help ease the burden and find the cure. For more than 50 years, APDA has funded pioneering research and provided critical support to those affected by Parkinson's. Visit apdaoptimism.org today to find out how you can help millions live with dignity and optimism. Your action today will help APDA put an end to Parkinson's disease.
Hello there, I'm Bruce Harders, and this is Voices in the Village. Well, last time we had a chance to talk to Bob Meyer, a young 93-year-old former captain in the U.S. Air Force who flew, what did you fly?
Gliders.
Gliders. We learned a lot about Bob and his family, his father Mac. As a matter of fact, one of his relatives helped to dine with George Washington on his farm, among other things. Another person down the line flew the old Jenny aircraft in the First World War. And Bob was a glider pilot. You also flew a little bit,
yes.
too. Now, I think what's really important is for our viewers to understand what these gliders look like. What were they built for? What could they do? That kind of thing, Bob.
At the beginning of the war, the one thing we did not have was the ability to deliver equipment like a Jeep or a howitzer or guns or ammunition to the front line for our troops. So what they decided to do, they would follow like other nations and create gliders. A glider is an airplane that was developed around the size of a Jeep, so that we could carry a Jeep into combat, because every colonel wanted his Jeep during the war. And we would carry guns, we would carry ammunition, landmines, whatever they wanted us to land behind the lines, we would carry this folk.
Now, you could only carry one Jeep at a time?
One Jeep at a time.
And would there, how many people would be on that?
Would be, that time it would be 3 with the Jeep. because
Just the
of
one
weight.
who, now, I thought I saw in one of the pictures you had some kind of a tank coming off that thing.
Well, that's a Hamel car, which is a larger glider. They did not offer that in my unit, so I didn't have to fly those.
But they were out there being flown.
Yes, and they were very top heavy, and that was bad in combat.
What would be the problem in combat?
Problem is, you land on sand or loam, and the wheels would drag, and the thing would roll over.
Uh-huh.
So that was not good.
What did this plane look like? Glider.
Well, a CG-4 looks like a flying boxcar.
Uh-huh.
It had no motors. It had an 84-foot wing spread. Had a carrying capacity of 13 troopers if you were carrying men. And it was made out of canvas and balsa, plywood. And the interesting thing is, in flying in combat, when they would fire at us, we could hear the sound of those bullets going through the canvas like thung thung. I always appreciated that second thung because that meant the bullet had gone all the way through.
So you'd be up in the air, you'd be flying. How many miles would you go being towed by that bigger airplane?
Well, first you had to fly around southern England to all the air bases and pick up the next glider pilot unit to end up with a huge glider trail that may be 14 or 15 miles long. And then you would head it for the shore or go into, in this case, my first one was Normandy.
Uh-huh. Well, now, as an example, typically when you got in your glider and you were being pulled, would there only be one plane pulled at a time by one airplane?
One.
Okay, so how many miles would you fly from the time you got up in the air and you're now towed and being towed? How many miles would you probably be towed until you finally landed?
Well, since we had to accumulate the gliders, I would say a couple 100 miles.
So you could go a couple hundred. And how long would that take?
Well, it took us about 3 hours because we had to wait for them to join us.
So at the right, you knew exactly when the time would be to dislodge yourself from that big airplane.
That's right.
Now, how high above the ground would you be?
Well, as we completed assembling the gliders, we came across the here you have to split this in. Came across the water from England to France, and I couldn't believe my eyes. There was 4,000 ships in the British Channel.
Right.
And we flew across them about 650 feet. And then as we came towards Omaha Beach, the famous landing, we went down to 500 feet.
Now at 500 feet, you're pretty vulnerable.
Anybody with a rock in their hand could have hit us.
It's almost a miracle that you guys could go through that and still come out at the end.
Well, as my co-pilot said to me, "Hey, Bob, they're throwing stones at us." And I said, "How is that?" He said, "I can see the red streaks." Well, you don't have to watch many war movies to realize that was not a stone, but that was the bullet.
Right. So now you finally got onto the ground, which was no easy task.
No.
You had to. What things did you have to be careful of when you were starting to land?
Because you didn't know what was down there.
Uh-huh.
You didn't know whether there's a tree, a farmyard, or a ditch, or a river. You had to go down as based on a prayer, I guess, that you will be able to see the ground before you hit the ground.
Right. So you didn't want to go between trees and break your wings, or
No,
you didn't
as
want
we
to
cut
end up-
off the thing we saw that's really worried us, we saw what was later called Rommel's asparagus. These are the huge telephone poles that Rommel had planted in every field that was big enough for a landing.
Wow.
Now, to make it really bad, they had put a wire from the top of one pole to the bottom of the next pole, so if you dipped your wings to miss the pole, you hit the wire. And the wire was connected to a landmine. So it gave you a tremendous lift,
I would think so.
not the kind you appreciated.
That's right. Now, you told me a very funny story, probably the funniest story I've heard about the Second World War. Tell our viewers what that story is.
Well, I've told so many of them through the years. Give me a hint.
I'm talking about the one where the Luger was in your face.
Oh, I'm fine. The third mission I went on was where we crossed the Rhine, and I could see the rubber boats going across the river, and the Germans were retreating, so we landed about 5 miles behind the German lines, and we landed in a little woods of tiny trees, and the colonel said, you know, these Germans are going to be mad because they're now fighting in Germany. So dig a foxhole 6 foot deep. I'm telling you, folks, when you have to dig through the roots of small trees, it's murder. In fact, by the time I got done, I was so exhausted, I laid down and, believe it or not, time of war, in a foxhole, I fell asleep.
And then you woke up.
I woke up about 2 o'clock in the morning to find a German paratrooper standing in front of me with a P-38 pistol pointed in my face. He said, do you want to die? I said, hell no. He said, well, I don't either. Let's make a deal. Well, he had the gun, so I was glad to listen to a deal. He said, I am an American. I said, I understand you must be American because your English is so perfect. Yes, he said, I was sent by my parents to learn better German. So I came to, before the war, I came to my grandparents to study good German.
And there were thousands of kids that did that, I understand.
Every country in Europe.
And so obviously the Germans took over those kids and put them into service, right?
When war was declared, the Gestapo came to the family and came to the schools and said, what nationality are you? He said, I'm an American. He said, you mean you were born an American? He said, yeah. You can't do that in Germany.
Right.
You have to prove it.
Now it turned out that when you turned him, because you were able to turn him in, because the first guy that showed up was an American.
That's right.
And you, the next time you heard from him, he was back in the States. And how many miles from your house did he live?
Well, that's sort of interesting. When I was talking to him after I was captured, he said, I'm from Chicago. And I said, well, so am I. Where did you live? Rogers Park, which is the area furthest north in Chicago. He said, I lived on Lund Avenue. I said, that's a mile from me. So here I grew up not knowing this boy and running this situation.
What are the chances? What are the chances?
Very few, but after the war, I called his phone, and his mother answered the phone. She said, how did you know my boy, being I'm an American Army?
Right.
I said, well, I met him in a foxhole, and told the story. And she said, don't you ever call here again, which sort of shocked me for a moment, till I realized that she was the German sympathizer. And she didn't want me telling her neighbors that her son was not an American paratrooper, but was a German paratrooper.
Well, Bob, this has really been a wonderful experience, both the former time we sat down with you and this time. Thanks so very much for coming, and for you out there, I hope you enjoyed these stories about the Second World War. I'm Bruce Harders with Voices in the Village, and we'll see you next time. Bye now.